Our next speaker is Dr. Harlan Ullman. Dr. Ullman is a widely recognized national security expert. He and James Wade are known for coining the term shock and awe. I'm going to repeat that, shock and awe. You might remember that from Operation Iraq Freedom. It's a tactic based on the use of overwhelming power and spectacular displays of force to paralyze the enemy's perception of the battlefield and destroy their will to fight. I think it was used quite effectively and to establish rapid dominance in 2003 in the invasion of Iraq. Now, Dr. Ullman recently published The Fifth Horseman and the New MAD. Not MAD as we might all know as mutually assured destruction, but MAD as massive attacks of disruptions. I just finished reading the book and I actually read it while I was on vacation. Once I opened the cover, I actually couldn't put it down. So kudos for Dr. Ullman. Like our artist Albrecht Dürer, whose famous woodcut of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, that depicts death, famine, war, and plague with unnerving emotion. Dr. Ullman writes about how failing governments, climate change, cyber vulnerabilities, social media influence, accessibility of drones, and crippling national debt have perhaps created a fifth horseman with compelling conviction. His book has been well received with high praise from Admiral Jim Stavridis and General John Allen. Dr. Ullman, welcome to our town hall.
Hey, Jay, thank you very much. It was a good lead-in with the Four Horsemen, and I appreciate that. Thank you for putting that up. A word about shock and awe. Shock and awe in Iraq was not what we thought shock and awe should be. I won't go into great detail if you read the book. The idea was to win without fighting, and unfortunately, Tommy Franks used it as a buzzword. And when the bombs began falling on Baghdad, the Daily Telegraph had a full-page photograph of bombs exploding with the headline, Baghdad Blitz, and shock and awe, shock sunk without trace. Anyway, we can discuss that later. I'm only going to talk for about 10 or 12 minutes, so your team can ask questions, and I'm going to focus most on the defense and national security side, even though the book is much broader. AJ did an excellent job of describing the book in terms of the overview. So let me make just a couple of points. During the Cold War, you will recall that mutual assured destruction meant that because both the United States and the Soviet Union possessed tens of thousands of not only of nuclear weapons, but thermonuclear weapons, which were 1,000 times more powerful than those dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, war was deterred. Well, virtually nobody was killed during the Cold War. Now a new MAD has arisen. We saw it 2 years ago in January of 2020 when COVID arrived, and not only COVID, but huge storms took power out of parts of Texas. Cyber hacks deprived us of meat and of gasoline in the Northeast, and they were just a series of different disruptions. A ship being stuck in the Suez Canal cut off supply chain, and actually we saw the Canadian drivers who themselves were massive attacks of disruption. How did this come to pass? The reason it came to pass is that societies have become more advanced. They have become more vulnerable, more fragile, more weaknesses, and more dependent and interdependent. For example, supposing you lost your electrical power for a long time, supposing you lost your cell phone or your internet, or on and on and on and on, life would be very difficult, much more so. And these things are not only possible, they're happening every single day, whether acts of man or acts of nature. Now, the book is composed of 10 chapters. The introduction presents a very dystopian view of America in 2029 when the first female president is elected, and she's inaugurated from a secure location, which is an underground White House that looks more like a concrete iceberg because the White House was bombed to destruction by drones. The point was to get the reader's attention. The first chapter explains what the major disruptors are, and AJ mentioned them. The second goes on to explain how this happened and what we need to do about it. Next 3 chapters are about President Xi and President Putin, in which I make the point, they say what they mean and they mean what they say, and if we really listen to what they write, we might be a lot better off. The next chapters go on to a description of the pandemic of 1918 to 1920 with today, which is really quite remarkable for a number of reasons. The world then was even more disruptive in some ways than you can imagine. We were in the middle of a world war, at the end of a world war. President Wilson was a victim of a stroke, and his wife Edith was running the country. The Espionage and Sedition Acts had been passed, which made it against the law to criticize the war, and people actually were apprehended for dismissing Army uniforms and criticizing them. But more importantly, the country was awash in terror. 24 letter bombs, in which only 2 people killed, provoked national panic and led to the detainment of hundreds of thousands of people and the deportment of about 10,000 people without just cause, the so-called Palmer raids. But what happened in addition to the pandemic, when the pandemic ended and Warren Harding became president, he put in place the first National Highway Act and began the greatest economic boom in America's history. Now, the reason I think that's important is because one of my major conclusions is for a national investment infrastructure fund, and I'll touch on that in a minute. Then the book goes on, the last 3 chapters, which are probably most important, which get into national security, national defense, and what we need to do with critiques of Congress, the executive branch, and our policies and our strategies. One of my suggestions, if you want, and I say this with tongue in cheek, if you want to fix Congress overnight, one step will do that. Before any member of Congress votes on a bill, he or she has got to affirm or swear that they have read and understood it. This is the equivalent of Sarbanes-Oxley for government. Now, people will laugh, but in 1973, when Don Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense for the first time, how long was the Defense Authorization Bill? 93 pages. How long is it today? 4,000 in the House and almost 3,000 in the Senate. That's absurd. That's absurd. If members of Congress say, gee, it's just impossible, we have to change the way we're doing business. Now, I realize that's not going to be a recommendation that's going to be absorbed, but it means to make the point. And as I said, my largest recommendation, the most important recommendation, is this infrastructure account, infrastructure bank. Now, some people will say we've already allocated $1.2 trillion for infrastructure. But as you know, because there's no budget, not a penny has been appropriated or spent yet. And it may be some time before Congress actually passes a budget for that to happen. My recommendation is to draw on the 1922-23 economic boom and to raise about $2 or $3 trillion from private sector investment in what I would have as 30-year bonds, treasuries, like war bonds were created in World War II. They'd pay about 2% above prime, which is a pretty good investment right now. And they would be used to seed infrastructure across the board. For example, right now, as we are unprepared for COVID-19, we're unprepared for COVID 20, 21, 22, 23. And so we need to put in place various operations that are going to be prepared to deal with these looming disruptions. But take that money and take the 1.2 trillion and put it together, and you have $3 or $4 trillion in which can be used, as I said, for infrastructure modernization, updating, and repair. The big difference is, however, would be oversight. Sitting on a number of boards, you know that boards of directors, if they're any good, are going to oversight the company for which they've been established. Oversight on the part of the federal government is not good. Look at Hurricane Katrina. And right now, the oversight for the investment fund is not particularly good either. So what you would be able to raise the amount of money that I think we need really to put us on a good footing for the 21st century, making us very, very competitive, and be able to do the things that are absolutely necessary. Will that happen? We'll see. But I think it's the one way that we can really deal with these very, very difficult circumstances. About national security and national defense, let me start with the misorganization. If you take a look at the way Congress is organized and the way the whole government is organized, each branch, almost each agency is organized differently. The House Armed Services and Senate Armed Services Committee have various subcommittees, but they're not organized the way the Pentagon is, and the Pentagon is not organized the way the State Department is, or the National Security Council or the CIA. So major organization here is really critical. I also am very, very critical of the National Security Act for a number of reasons. before the first National Security Act was passed in 1947, and Harry Truman, as you will know, opposed it, the United States, after the War of 1812, won every war it fought. I would argue that after the passage of the National Security Act of 47, we've lost every battle, every war we fought. The irony is that the US military is very adept at winning battles, but the country's not good at winning wars. So what do we need to do? First, I think what you have to do is disaggregate the Joint Chiefs of Staff from the service chiefs. There are split loyalties, and the Joint Chiefs ought to be our senior strategic advisory board that spends its time on strategy. And the chiefs of service spend their time on managing their organizations because, quite frankly, given the rules and regulations that had to be designed by the KGB, because no rational person would have done it, the service chiefs have got to be much more focused on running their services, leading their services, and the Joint Chiefs on the strategy because we have a much more complicated world. And I would put the chairman back in the chain of command because he's got to have the responsibility as well as the authority. As principal advisor to the president, he's not going to be held responsible really for anything. I would also reorient the Unified Command Plan. We've got 11 various combatant commanders. That's far too many. During World War II, who reported to Admiral King? Two guys, Nimitz in the Pacific and Stark in the Atlantic. Who reported to George Marshall? Two guys, MacArthur in the Pacific and Eisenhower in the Atlantic. So we need to streamline our Unified Command Plan. Perhaps the most interesting suggestion I make is in terms of implementing what I call a porcupine defense. Porcupine defense is entirely based on disruption. What you want to do is to make the cost of an initial attack so expensive that nobody would ever even contemplate attacking the United States in the first place. How do you do it? You don't do it with big ships like aircraft carriers and F-35s, though some of those are going to be needed. You do it with literally thousands of drones of all sorts, air, sea, and land. You do it with all sorts of deception systems, electronic warfare systems, to make it impossible for an enemy really to be able to coordinate an attack. You disrupt them in every way possible. And to give you some trade-offs, and I may get the numbers wrong, but in lieu of a $30 billion carrier task force, carrier battle group, how many $1 million missiles could you get instead? Or $100,000 drones? The trade-offs are just enormous. And so if you take a look at how you apply shock and awe is meant to put an enemy in a position where the situation is entirely hopeless, where you control the entire environment, you get him to see what you want to see and not see what you don't want to. It's an entirely different way of looking at war from the American traditional war, and actually goes back to Sun Tzu and the classics. There are a large number of other recommendations that I will make, but I think that I want to stop here. So I'm sure that you have lots of questions. The book is more broadly based than just on the military, obviously. And how would you fix Congress with the changes that you have to make, the changes in policy, changing the structure of the executive branch. We are still organized as if it were 1789 and George Washington was president. For example, we have a Department of Agriculture. Does anybody know how many independent farmers we have? They're statistically not observable. We have a Department of Education when it's all about learning. And so we need to look about how we modernize ourselves for the 21st century. But the point that I make, the takeaway is, Americans have to realize that when we think China and Russia or North Korea or Iran are the principal threats, and clearly what's happening in Ukraine, and I will say with a 90% certainty, Putin is not going to invade Ukraine. It would be the worst thing he could do. We need to understand that these massive attacks of disruption, whether acts of man or acts of nature, are the things that are not only killing people right now, but threaten our society. And we have to understand that failed and failing government, which is not providing what people want, is something that we have to fix. And the only way we're going to do that is recognition that we've moved from the model of the Cold War of mutual assured destruction to massive attacks of disruption. There are huge numbers of opportunities here if we're creative. The book not only points out the problems, but more importantly, it creates a number of the solutions which I think can be implemented. And I think that this is the way to lead to the 21st century. If it's not done on the current course, we will not implode like the Soviet Union. But I assure you, your standards of living are going to decline dramatically, and the American dream is going to be increasingly elusive. And that's not a country we want to see our children and grandchildren living in. I'll stop there, AJ, and thanks for your.
Indeed. Thank you so much. And I already see a couple of questions. And Nicole, please take a look through the chat as well as emails for some. So, Dr. Ullman, some of the first of all, really intriguing suggestions. Do you think there could be a Goldwater Nichols 3, where in fact some of those reorganizations could potentially occur in DoD?
Yes, I argue for that. I think that Goldwater Nichols has passed its due date. I think it's destroying the Pentagon we can go into large reasons, but it's nonsensical. We've got jointness for the sake of jointness. You know, it's 40 years old or almost 40 years old. That's got to be changed. And I talk about how we change this in the Pentagon, including lateral entries. There's no reason why you couldn't have 65-year-old Trident submariners. I mean, they're not going to be running around, so forth and so on, or 70-year-old cyber experts. So there are a lot of creative ways that we have to look at remanning, because we can't afford the professional force. As Arnold Pinaro, who many of you know, writes, the more we spend, the smaller the force gets because of this uncontrolled cost growth. And we got to recognize that. Yeah,
the personnel costs have just been, I mean, it's been very difficult for
everything is going up 5 to 7%, which doubles in 10 years, from pencils to precision weapons to people. We haven't realized that, and we just can't spend all this money on defense. We got a $30 trillion deficit.
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know what Goldwater Nichols is, after the National Security Act, there are really two very major pieces of legislation, Goldwater Nichols 1 and 2, which really set the organizational structure, roles, and responsibilities across both DoD, OSD, the JCS, and the services. So I think a lot of folks have been talking about and suggesting changes, perhaps which could become a Goldwater Nichols 3, and really enjoyed some of the suggestions that you just summarized for us. And your book was truly captivating. I think in particular, I would just want to go to your last words in the book about the final warning and wish. You mentioned two things. One is perhaps we should all be on the lookout for perhaps the potential failure of arms control, as well as the changing demographics. I think, especially I remember in 2008, as the world economic growth rate went from 3.5% to 2%, right? As well as the deleveraging that had to occur around the world. I saw that as a significant event. Fortunately, perhaps that didn't drive a lot of the national security threats that we saw as a nation, but I could certainly see, as you suggest, that could in the future. Any comments on both of those aspects?
Absolutely. First, I would argue one of our great, and this is very important for your company. Yeah. One of the greatest failings of this country, its inability to have sufficient knowledge and understanding of others. I fought in Vietnam. I opposed the Iraq War. We were clueless. I opposed Afghanistan in many ways. About 2006, we were losing. My point is that how we achieve the knowledge and understanding and get into the White House is really, really, really quite vital. About arms control. Our systems are aging. We got to replace everything. And we're replacing them in kind, fewer numbers, because they cost the earth. I mean, what is a B-21 going to cost, or a Columbia class? The Russians have already modernized. The Chinese, and I don't think the Chinese are going to build up as much as people think, but they're modernizing. We need arms control, because in the past, where nuclear weapons cost 3 or 4% maybe of the budget, it's going to be 7 or 8%. Where's that going to come from?
Indeed.
It's going to come from the conventional forces. Now, about people, we need a hybrid force. It's got to be part professional, and it's got to be part draft, for any number of reasons. If we move to the porcupine force, I think we can do it with 800,000, 900,000 people at most, divided 3 ways. Those who are deployed, those who are resting, and those who are about to deploy. And we can not only save a lot more money, but we can be a lot more effective and a lot more efficient, depending obviously much more on allies in a new structure that I lay out in terms of a new NATO and a new Pacific framework.
Yeah, there are a few other questions here I did want to make sure we get a chance to address. So we might go to about 10:35 if that's okay for everyone.
I'm good to go for as long as you'd like.
Great, appreciate that. So I'll summarize this one. If we don't agree to keep, if we do not agree to keep Ukraine out of NATO, what has Putin gained by the exercise?
I'll I'll send you my late, if you go online in the Atlantic Council, I put a paper out yesterday, why Putin is not going to invade. First of all, there is no way Ukraine is getting into NATO. It's got divided borders. It's never going to pass the test. And if in a fair vote, very few people want Ukraine or Georgia into NATO. It's not going to happen. But here we are on a principle. NATO's got to be open, but this is not going to happen. Putin has taken his three basic aims: a new framework in Europe, no NATO expansion, and Ukraine not in NATO, and conflated them into four different contradictory arguments and demands. In fact, the latest one just came out of Moscow today. None of those are achievable. Moscow wants legally binding treaties that NATO will not ever expand. Well, he's a lawyer. He knows that's not going to happen. Take a look at the litany of treaties. No more ABM, no more open skies, no more INF, no more Rome Agreement, all the things that the Russians. So what makes you think it's going to be legally binding? That's absurd. Putin knows that if he invades, and even a small incursion is going to the same reaction, there is going to be not only hell to pay in Russia, there's going to be an economic recession or even a depression. And this will really unite NATO in terms of things of isolating Russia, new sanctions, so forth and so on. So Putin will actively catalyze destruction. Remember, 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis in October '62, Khrushchev got booted for a harebrained scheme. I believe that if Putin gets into Ukraine, and I was just off, we have a Russia-NATO group that's really quite high-powered. We had Sam Nunn, for example, and George Robertson, the former General Secretary of NATO, talking today. He knows it's disastrous. He wants to be heard. And if you read my book, he has 20 years of resentment going back to 2001 and the abrogation of ABM, which was the centerpiece. He cautioned Bush, before you go into Afghanistan, be careful. We experienced very unhappy times. Don't go into Iraq. And he made all this known in 2005 at the Munich Security Conference when he complained about what was happening, NATO expansion. Whether you agree or not, he has grievances. And quite frankly, some of those are very fair, and we just seem to not understand them. We should negotiate on his terms. As I said, I think there's a 90% chance that he won't go in. If anything happens, this will be Barbara Tuchman's March of Folly. This will be World War I, and some kind of accident will happen. But barring that, Putin's not going in because it'd be the worst thing he can do. He wants attention. He's got to the point where he's fed up with us. And so he wants to get these arrangements. And Joe Biden, I think, who I like, needs to be Scranton Joe and not Georgie Patton. Stop saying the Russians are coming, or Paul Revere. You know, the Russians were arriving yesterday, but they're a little bit late, so they're going to be here next week. Come on. And by the way, can you really trust U.S. intelligence? Can you? We didn't do very well in Iraq. We certainly didn't do very well in Afghanistan. And I'm not criticizing people, so forth and so on. What I'm saying is that it gets politicized. I wish we would really do a good red team on the intelligence to make sure we know what we're talking about.
Intriguing. So let's finish up with two more questions real quick, if you don't mind. One is, how long did it take you to write the book?
Well, I did it during COVID.
Okay.
So it took me 3 months, and then I rewrote it so I'd have something to do. I'm a very fast writer. During the second Gulf War, 2003-4, I was a columnist for the New York Post. And so they want 2 columns a day. And rather than write them, I learned to dictate them on the fly. And so what I do in my own mind is I dictate everything in my mind, and then it's very easy to write. But it's not something that I would, and I get the title and work backwards.
Okay.
So for example, my last book before this one was Anatomy of Failure, Why America Loses Every War It Starts. And everything falls into place. So get your title.
Follow up to Barbara Tuchman's book that you referenced.
Yeah, absolutely.
So a second question, and we'll finish up with that. So I was speaking of Barbara Tuchman and basically failure of strategy. Do you have any tips for how we should think about strategy? Any tips for how to make strategy better?
Absolutely. We need a strategy for disruption. Our national security strategy should be based on preventing, containing, and defending against. And the point that you make for defense would be engaging. This contain, deter, and defend is nonsense. Okay? First of all, define it. Are we containing China and Russia? We don't seem to be doing very well. Are we deterring China from Belt and Road, from what it's doing? Are we deterring Russia? Deterrence only works in my mind during the Cold War with nuclear MAD, for example. It doesn't work very well. And defeat. General, would you please tell me how we're going to defeat China with 1.5 billion people? Or tell me how we're going to defeat Russia, who's got as many nuclear weapons and more tactical nuclear weapons? So we don't want to do that. We want to contain the problem. We want to prevent it when we can. We're going to defend when we have to, and we want to engage. We need to be talking to China and Russia. And this notion of being children on both sides who are not going to talk to each other, it's ludicrous. This is ludicrous. So as I repeat, contain, prevent, defend, and engage. And we need to stress engagement.
Well, thank you so much for such a captivating talk and really intriguing suggestions. And I really, really highly recommend Dr. Ullman's both of his books, the ones that he both referenced, the Apocalypse, as well as the prior book on the anatomy of failure. I see there's someone raising their hand.
We have Dr. Ullman again.
Can we get you back for another talk?
I'm free. I'd love to. And maybe if your team buys some books, you can get into it. There are a lot of interesting, go back and take a look at 1918, 1920, which is fascinating, which is really fascinating.
We'll do that. And we'll, in fact, I think for the next one, we'll invite our clients. So we'll get a wider audience. It'll be great to, and we'll get perhaps reserve more time for questions because it's a fascinating topic.
Thank you. Thank you, team.
Yeah, we're welcome. And thank you so much. And we're looking forward to having you back. Right. So John.